Alright, let's start the new video. I do apologize if it's slightly dark, but it should work at least. So, from The Prince, The Legacy of Alexander, this one will be on chapter 4 of The Prince. Now this is a shorter chapter, but it's still long enough that I do believe it deserved its own video. See, in chapter 4, why the kingdom of Darius, conquered by Alexander, did not rebel against the successors of Alexander at his death, this is the title, if you are confused. Machiavelli goes into the reasons why states are able to hold certain lands easier than others. Basically, why, when you invade a country, are you able to hold it or not? Because he does make a fairly good point when he states that Alexander went in, conquered all of Persia within a very short time frame, and yet, when it came time for Alexander's death, a premature one as well, what happened was that his successors ruled themselves instead of a new Persian Empire or new Egyptian state or whatever breaking off. And that's an important thing to ask because it raises a very good point. These empires, like for example the Achaemenid Persians, or Achaemenids, I'm not good at pronunciation for them, regardless, the Persians formed by Cyprus, they ruled for centuries over much of their territories. When Alexander marched in, the Persians had been in those regions for a long, long time. And yet, the Diadachi, the successors of Alexander, his generals, were able to rule their own territories without much resistance. The Ptolemies ruled Egypt, Seleucus ruled Persia proper, Antigonus ruled parts of Anatolia, and later his successors would rule, if I'm not mistaken, Macedon. And the other Diadachi were able to do several things, including some Greeks, which I'm pretty sure invaded India, which was a whole thing. But there is a reason why they were able to do this, especially when we compare it to other states, like, for example, Afghanistan, which was occupied by the Soviets, and yet was able to kick them out and maintain its own territory. Or why, even after hundreds of years, the Polish still held on to their beliefs in state. See, to be governed in two different ways, either by a prince with a body of servants, or by a prince and barons, those are the two ways a principality can be governed. And of course, we've already established what a principality is if you've watched the previous videos. But what this essentially is defining is the difference between a feudal state and a more centralized bureaucratic state. Think of it as the difference between a modern country versus a confederation. In a modern unitary state, or even to a lesser extent a federal state, the state itself is supreme in all things. The U.S. government even has in its constitution a supremacy clause which states that the government of the United States, the highest government, is the superior government. All others must kneel before its rulings. However, in a feudal system, technically, yes, the king is in charge. He pays no taxes, but the barons pay to him. However, he has obligations to the barons. Don't take my lands. Don't do these certain things. Protect me from outsiders. These agreements between the prince and the barons, or a king and his feudal lords, is in essence the feudal structure. It's a mutual contract of defense which carries a lot of, shall we say, implications. Machiavelli would later give two examples from his time, those being the Ottoman Empire, or as he calls it, the monarchy of the Turk, and the French kingdom. He who considers both of these states will recognize the great difficulties in seizing the state of the Turk, but once it is conquered, great ease in holding it. What he is essentially saying is, a bureaucratic state will, by its nature, be far more powerful because it's centralized. It's more concentrated within a few, and if not constantly bickering amongst itself. So any allies you'll be able to find internally to help you, overthrow the state or conquer it, will, naturally speaking, be less powerful than in a feudal one, while simultaneously the monarch can concentrate more power and use it effectively to secure their interests. However, it is worth noting, historically, that this would later be proven false post-World War I for the Ottomans specifically. But it wasn't because Machiavelli's reasoning was wrong. He was actually correct. Rather, it's because of how the Ottomans would evolve over the years. See, internal factions produced a group loyal to something else and with the power to act. The Young Turks was a political organization dedicated to nationalism. Now, nationalism in the 1800s is a very complicated thing, and it would continue well into the 1900s. But the reason it's important here is because it would essentially become like a baron, or like a minor ruler for a lot of people. Because, sure, you obey that dude, could be the Kaiser of Germany, maybe it's the President of France, but you're German first, you're French first. You kneel to that, to the nationality. The nationality is more important. Much as Machiavelli discusses the barons, for a local person, having an amiable relation with said locals, and thus a closer connection. Nationality acted, in many ways, as a baron would, and so it effectively replaced them. But also, importantly, for the Young Turks, they were military leaders. They had a lot of control over the Ottoman army. So when the Ottomans would eventually lose to the Entente and were carved up, the army, seeing the situation, acted almost like a baron would in Machiavelli's time and overthrew them, establishing the Republic of Turkey, and began trying to push out the other territorial claimants, those being the Greeks, the British, the Kurds, French, and Armenians. Now, in the case of the Kurds and the Armenians, they were more proxies for the British and French, but they had their own interests, so we can't exactly discount them. And so while Machiavelli would be correct, yes, an administrative state is far easier to take over and just rule, something we see a lot of with China, for example, with dynasties coming and going and just basically replacing the one before it. When it comes to modern times, with nationalism being in play, nationalism itself often acts in a similar manner to a baron would in terms of inspiring one to action. But then there's the matter of feudalism and the feudal states. One could easily enter there by gaining over some baron of the kingdom, but if you wish to hold it afterwards, you meet with infinite difficulties. This, in reference to France and its kingdom, was a statement made based on that feudal belief, and it would be correct. You can easily convince a person who's powerful to overthrow their government, if they believe it necessary in a feudal state. There were plenty of barons who would actually be more powerful than their king sometimes, and in fact, early on when feudalism was getting established under the Carolingians, aka the Franks, they would have a system where basically the person who rules the manor would rule the Franks, even though, technically speaking, they weren't technically in charge. Because of their influence, they would carry more influence than the kings. I do apologize if I said that weird. Regardless, the main point is, when feudalism is the structure where local lords have power and influence, there will be those who will gain a lot of power and influence. Some who will gain even more than the central monarch. After all, if you have, let's say, the Netherlands as a kingdom, but also feudal, the people in charge of Holland will naturally have greater influence than those who are in charge of Frisia, and maybe even the Netherlands as a whole, because, plain and simply, a lot of trade goes through there, so they have a lot of wealth and a lot of influence. So if the king were, say, stationed in either Frisia, Utrecht, or any other smaller part of the Netherlands, you would find it that Holland would be more influential. It's why a lot of the Dutch state is centered in Holland. It's the most influential part of the country. But we also see it earlier on with the 100 Years' War, where the English found when invading France that, sure, they could get dukes on side, barons, and all sorts of things. They even got the Burgundians on side, true. But it would be difficult to actually control them since now they had to appease them afterwards. You get the barons, great. What happens after when they're going to say, hey, I want my rewards for helping you, or I want more lands. Give me back the rights that the French king took from me. Whatever it is, they have their own demands, and it becomes much harder to handle. And the French, too, would find a similar situation when they tried invading England. Yeah, sure, they could get through, but the issue is, once the King of England would sort out their issues with the barons, the French would then find themselves in a precarious situation. And furthermore, dealing with the English barons was just a pain for the French. So, fundamentally, when it comes to occupying a feudal state, it's far harder because, plain and simply, they have other loyalties. The loyalty of a baron is not to the king necessarily. Yes, there's an agreement, but fundamentally, their loyalty is to themselves, and their people's loyalty is to them. They aren't bowing to the king. The person in charge of Frisia is not bowing to the Dutch monarch. He's bowing to, well, the people there, and the people bow to him. They are the primary agreement because he is the ruler of them. He just has to pay a few taxes to the guy in charge. And of course, that carries a lot of issues when it comes to centralization. But it also means it's a lot harder to occupy a territory. Machiavelli, being Italian, would particularly know this because, well, feudalism was a big thing in Italy, but also there were a lot of smaller states, a lot of very independent-minded states in Italy. So while you would have, of course, the Signoria and other structures within, say, Florence, you would find duchies in the north, the Kingdom of Naples in the south, the nobles of Sicily, and all that. All of them with their own influence, their own goals, and their own desires. So when someone would push in, say the Spanish in Sicily or Naples, or the French in Milan, you would find difficulties because they would have to appease the locals, making it far harder to occupy. Sure, it could eventually be done, but it was a giant pain. As for past references, even before Machiavelli's time, we would find him comparing the Ottomans to the Achaemenid Persians, and he would simultaneously compare the more distant Roman provinces of Hispania, Gaul, and Greece to feudal France, making the point that the Achaemenids were, well, heavily centralized. They were like a centralized bureaucracy, and so would function like it. Alexander just had to take over, eliminate the heads, the people in charge, and basically just run it as he used to, with people not loyal to their minister or satrap, but to the people in charge of the empire. When they were replaced, Alexander became that person, and so it was far easier to run, especially as Alexander's successors kept making comparisons to him. Meanwhile, when it came to the Roman provinces, what happened was they had a lot of their own local tribal rulers, or local cities. So it would be much closer to the feudal model because, well, you just remove the king and it's still the same problem of local lords and barons. You can appease them for now, get them as a protectorate or whatever agreement you have, but they're still loyal to themselves first and foremost. So if you start going away from them, or having issues with control, they're going to act to try to get more independence, more freedom, less taxes, whatever. And so long as the memory of those old policies, tribes, and just groups is in the memory of the people, so long as they're in the memory of the people, you have a situation where, fundamentally, you have an unstable control of a territory. To go it further, But with the power of long continuance of the Roman Empire, the memory of them, the old rulers, passed away, and the Romans then became secure possessors. The memory is the key. But the moment that memory fades, the moment they start forgetting, oh yeah, I was Athenian, I was Spartan, Theban, yada yada, and start instead thinking, I'm a citizen of Rome, then they naturally have more loyalty to Rome, which they know, versus their old territories, which they don't remember. So, a barony, or that structure which we mentioned, ends up eventually fading. Its strength goes away over time as memory becomes more fickle and less solid. Essentially, the only way to really deal with the benefits of feudalism in terms of keeping it from your hands, so the things that benefit the old rulers, is legitimately to let it fade over time. You cannot do it any other way. Well, short of genocide, but I don't think anyone would say, oh yes, let me just massacre my entire tax base. Machiavelli may argue for brutality, but even he would say that would be stupid. Remember, Machiavelli's argument is not brutality is good. He does not say that Alexander crushing Darius' forces and killing any threats to his rule was good. He said that actions taken to further the state's interests are good. If it conveniently happens to include certain things, great. But you shouldn't just mindlessly be brutal. And that's an important distinction. See, that's just how people operate. They want continuity, trust. But the issue comes, how do you ensure it? As pointed out by Machiavelli in this chapter, there are several ways. If you establish a good system, you can run it well, keep it secure, and have the ability to defend more easily. It's a lot harder to take over the Ottomans when everything's a top-down, bureaucratic state versus a French kingdom which is divided among so many baronies, duchies, and counties that the French kings barely hold any amount of France. But while the Ottomans have issues actually holding onto that territory once they do lose it, the French will make it far harder for you to hold it instead. And factoring all these things in, we get to Machiavelli's final statement. When these things are remembered, no one will marvel at the ease with which Alexander held the Empire of Asia, or at the difficulties which others have had in keeping an acquisition. This is not occasioned by the little or abundance of ability in the conqueror, but by the want of uniformity in the subject state. People like what they get used to. A top-down state will naturally be more easily integrated into a top-down state, and people used to local or self-rule will naturally favor that over the extension of rule by another. It takes until the people get used to the new status quo that it becomes a stable position. The Persian territories were able to be stable because, well, Alexander just took the top off and replaced him with it. He became the head of the Persian Empire, in effect. And so the people didn't mind too much. Things were resolved. It was over. Okay, great. And so it continued. But people do not like when their local rulers are replaced or are taken away. To use a interesting example, the United States with the American colonies. See, the American colonies had a position of relative neglect and freedom within the British Empire and were fairly valuable colonies. But here's the issue. Those colonies were used to that independence. So when the British, trying to centralize power and properly run these colonies so they could maximize revenue because, well, they were in debt massively, they found an issue. Great. We tried to centralize power. We made all these acts to try to tax and manage the colonies. Now they hate us. Why? because they were used to that freedom. They were used to being able to elect their own people, to try their own people, to handle things like, in their view, like Englishmen. When that was taken away, they got angry, and so they fought back. This is just how conquest is. People get used to things, and they like continuity and uniformity. When that's broken, tensions arise. And so, look in it for your own state and how things have gone throughout it historically. I do hope you enjoyed. Thank you for watching.